All right, here is our last slide for topic 8. I'd like for us to look at Eastern Europe and Russia, and I'm hoping that I don't run out of time because there's actually two slides here. So Europe is first, Russia is second. Okay, so Eastern Europe is dominated by Austria. Again, we mentioned how conservative they were, how they basically wanted to keep things the way that it had always been. But one of the problems that Austria had always dealt with is that their empire that they controlled was extremely diverse. Only about a quarter of their people were actually German speaking. The rest were either Slavs, Hungarians, Italians. There was a large Jewish population. So you had a lot of different people who weren't the same. They spoke different languages, had different cultures, and most of them wanted to have their own countries. And so that's, a problem for the Austrians. They tried to limit industrial development because they saw industry and bringing those types of things in would probably weaken their hold on that area. But industrialization was going to happen anyway. And of course, it did cause problems. The revolutions that happened in 1848 occurred also in Austrian territory, but these were crushed by the Austrians. But after this happened, their emperor, Francis Joseph, did put some reforms in. One of the things that he did to try to make the Hungarians a little bit more cooperative was to create the dual monarchy, where Austria and Hungary would be separate in some ways, but governed by the same person. One of the problems that this brought into being is that while the Hungarians were sort of okay with this, the other people didn't like it because they didn't get anything. So there's an underlying tension that's going to be there in Austria. In the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, they also governed multiple nationalities. In some ways, they did a little bit better job with this, but ultimately, these people who weren't Turks, who weren't Muslim, wanted to gain their independence. And so there's a constant push there. There was a war that was fought in the 1850s called the Crimean War. Russia saw an opportunity to take territory from Turkey, and of course, other European powers had a problem with this. So Britain and France and some other countries stepped in and stopped this from happening. But you can see that this didn't necessarily stop this taking national groups and putting them under the control of somebody else. There's still that tension that's there. And so one of the results is that this whole area of Europe around Greece, south of Austria, the Balkan Peninsula is sometimes called the powder keg of Europe. And ultimately, this area is going to explode into war. This is the area where World War I started. Okay, with Russia, huge territory, a government that wanted to try to make some reforms, but they really never quite got to that, largely because there were three things that were in place that kept the Russian government from ultimately embracing change from the outside. One is that these are called the three pillars. Orthodoxy, which is the Orthodox Church, which is very conservative, also very distrustful of the other churches. Autocracy, the idea that the king is an absolute ruler, and then nationalism, or being Russian, is the best thing in the world. You also had a rigid social structure that the people up at the top, the nobles, were not really interested in giving a lot of people power because that meant taking things from them, and they were very reluctant to do that. There was a czar in the middle of the 19th century, Alexander II, that tried to put some reforms in place. And you see from this list here that he did a lot of good. Probably the biggest thing is that he set the serfs free. But unfortunately, he was assassinated. And this made the Russian government become more reactionary. They decided, you know what, these reforms caused the czar to be assassinated, so we're just going to take all these reforms away and be harsh. So his son Alexander III really did a lot to make people angry. He followed this process of Russification, making minorities become Russian, making people not speak their native languages and speaking Russian and becoming Christian, Orthodox Christian. And this didn't cause a lot of people to want to really love them. One thing that starts to pick up in this time period are persecutions against Jews. Um, a lot of these Jews left, went to other parts of Eastern Europe. Many of them immigrated to the United States. You also have industrialization expanding under Alexander III's rule, but this didn't really bring a lot of wealth to most people. In fact, it created a lot of tensions, caused more radical groups to gain prominence. And when Alexander III's son Nicholas II becomes czar, here is a ruler that really was not capable of handling the trouble that he was facing. There was a major massacre of people who were protesting peacefully in 1905. They were asking the czar to help, and the czar wasn't even at the palace, but his guards butchered these people. It's called Bloody Sunday. There are lots of strikes. Lots of groups of people were wanting their autonomy from the Russian government. There was more terrorism that was happening. And there was an attempt to try to create a democratic system. They did create a parliament that was called the Duma in Russia. And while they did pass some reforms, they basically were still very conservative and didn't really push for a lot of changes. So, they kind of give people a little bit of taste of something, but then they don't really deliver with that democratic government. And so ultimately, this is going to be a problem with when World War I breaks out and the Bolsheviks, the radical communists, take over. So this concludes our slides for topic 8.